Start that, which should be good to go. So first, I want to take a moment to explain how the contract administration will work for this round. We finally have lots of hands on deck. You won't just have to deal with me. So I'll be serving as the contract administrator for Kimley Horn and WSP, as they're going to be doing the pilot project for integrating resilience into CAMA land use plans. Kaysen and Jennifer will serve as the administrators for the firms listed under their names. So these will be your go-to RCCP contacts and the people you'll be submitting progress reports and invoices to, and who can answer questions about the program and your deliverables. So please keep your RCCP contact in the loop on any scheduled community action team meetings or public engagement events. That way we can try to attend when possible and stay informed about your progress. So the idea for today's contractor training came out of an internal review following that first round of the RCCP in 2022, where we identified opportunities to provide additional guidance and support to our contractors. So we hope today's session will help you gain a better understanding of equitable community engagement and creative ways to engage communities, hopefully learn about nature-based solutions and explore potential project ideas and see what's worked on the ground. We also want you to take advantage of opportunities to network with each other and learn from one another's experiences. You guys will all be kind of going through the same process over the next 12 months. And then finally, we encourage you to ask us questions and actively participate throughout the training. And I do have, hopefully my colleagues monitoring the chat, so you're welcome to put a question in the chat too. So many of you are already familiar with the resilience strategy. You've guided communities through this process before, but for our new contractors, this will be the first time you're helping a community create one of these through the RCCP. So the resilience strategy is really the key takeaway from phases 1 and 2. It's the community's roadmap for what comes next. Their project portfolio, their priorities, and their plan for going after funding and making things happen on the ground. And that's why this document matters so much. So when it's done well, a resilience strategy sets a community up for success. It gives them the language, the data, and the clear next steps they need to complete or compete for grants and start implementing projects. We learned a lot from the first round of the RCCP. Some of the project descriptions we saw at the beginning could be a bit too broad or maybe lacked numbers. For example, some said, construct a living shoreline, but didn't specify how many linear feet or what sites were considered. And we know that that was because there was a lot of funding limitations and there was COVID and it was a tight timeline. So, but now hopefully with a little bit more funding and we've got a 12-month contract period now, we're hoping that these project portfolios can be a little more expansive. Where you can kind of dig into what exactly the project is, what the benefits will be, and how it can be accomplished. So the goal of this is that a community should be able to literally lift the information out of this document, copy and paste it into a grant application. So the clearer and the more detailed you can make it, the easier it is for them to take action. And the technical appendix, Kaysen spent most of his life this year updating that. So this will be your go-to support tool through phases 1 and 2. So it does 2 things. It summarizes the key materials in the handbook, and then it provides you extra resources you can use at any time. So we tried to update these with the most up-to-date resources and data portals. But if you find something that's broken, please let us know. In here, you'll also find templates, relevant maps, formatting tips for consistency, and then also tons of examples from previous rounds. So feel free to use it as a quick reference whenever you need guidance. It's there to save time and help you produce a clear and strong deliverable. And then finally, these next steps are not requirements under your phase 1 and 2 contract, but if you have the capacity, you can help your community get a head start on what comes next. So you might want to work with them to help them prepare for phase 3, help keep the community action team engaged after phase 2 ends, or help them integrate their resilience strategy into planning documents. You also can help them identify opportunity for feasibility studies, helping them find partners, looking for grant funding, which is a challenge right now, but we can help with that too. And then providing feedback to us about what worked well and what didn't. Because like I said, we're constantly evolving this program and trying to improve it. So we take constructive criticism seriously. So don't feel bad telling us what's not working. And then finally, the more detailed and forward-looking you make the project portfolio, the better position your community is going to be to secure funding either through us or someone else and help their projects move towards implementation. So with all of that out of the way, I'm very excited to introduce our first speaker, Dr. Miki Hino from UNC Chapel Hill. Dr. Hino has been working with us over the past year on an evaluation of the RCCP. Today, she'll share some of her early findings and insights from the process so far. This evaluation will be incredibly valuable for us at DCM once it's finished. We're hoping it's going to help us understand how the program's performing, where we can improve, and what impact we're having across North Carolina's coastal communities. And just as importantly, this kind of data is going to help us make the case for continued investment and being able to continue the program. So being able to show these outcomes and lessons learned, hoping to attract additional funding, keeping the program strong for future rounds. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Hino. Let's see, there she is. I don't think I can hear you, Miki.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
No.
No, I can. Yes.
No. 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 No.
Oh my
No.
goodness.
No.
Okay.
No. 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 No.
Let's
No.
see.
No.
Let's
No.
stop her video.
No. No.
Um, while she's maybe getting that working, we could try to move to Rebecca and Georgina.
Can I test? Can you hear me at all?
There you go. Whew.
There was a combination of changing my audio source and muting and unmuting, and I was not, it went very poorly. But can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, that's totally fine. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, yeah, let's go ahead and jump in. So this evaluation, as Mackenzie said, we've been working on it for about not quite a year, but coming up on a year. And there are three different components to it. So to give you a sense of the big picture, the first thing we did is we really looked at who the RCCP is serving. And so we pulled all of the data on who's eligible, who has applied, and who's been part of the program, and who's been advancing through multiple phases or not. We looked at the selection process, and so who's getting scored, whose applications are getting scored better or worse, and how is that shaping which communities are getting RCCP resources. The second stage of what we did, oh, hang on a second, but there we go. The second stage of what we did was really focusing on what is the process for the RCCP, and focused really on the first two phases, because phases 3 and 4 look so different for every community. And so we did kind of a detailed tracing of what activities are being conducted, and then did an evaluation of the quality of the outputs, which I'll focus on for the rest of this talk. And then the third piece is looking at the impact of the RCCP on the communities that have gone through it. And so how is that affecting awareness of risk, political will to undertake and pursue resilience projects, preparedness for resiliency projects in the form of applying for grants, and then ultimately, is it changing the amount of money going into resiliency in different communities? So today, given all of you are here for phases 1 and 2, I'll talk mostly about what we're finding with the process evaluation. Go ahead to the next slide. Okay, so we did two main things in this process evaluation. The first thing we did was we did a very detailed scoring on resilience strategies. We reviewed about a dozen to create a scoring system, and then we did this very detailed scoring on 4 communities. So I'll talk through what we saw there in terms of strengths and weaknesses, and what made some strategies stand out as really strong as compared to others. And we also did a bunch of interviews. So we interviewed local government staff in 4 participating communities, a bunch of contractors, including many of you. So thank you for participating in the evaluation, as well as other key stakeholders farther out from the RCCP. So not directly participating, but in related fields. Next slide. Okay, So for our evaluation of resilience strategies, we took the strategies and divided them up based on what's in the handbook. And so there are 7 main sections, from vision and goals, review of local and regional efforts. I'm sure these look very familiar to many of you that have done phases 1 and 2 before. And then for each of those sections, we broke it down into a total of 22 scorable components. And so we scored each component from 1 to 5, where 1 is the component wasn't even there or was effectively not even there. And then 5 was like people really, the resilience strategy really goes above and beyond what's in the handbook for this particular component. So to give you a sense of those sections and components, you can go to the next slide. And this is what this looks like in terms of the breakdown of sections and what gets scored. And so in the vision and goal section, there's only 1 score, and you get scored on the community vision and the goals, as well as the description of the process for developing ideas around that vision. Whereas for the stakeholder engagement strategy section, there were 3 components that got scored. One was there a plan for engagement with the community during these different processes? Did any targeted stakeholder outreach occur to groups that typically aren't represented well in these processes? And then third, how well was it documented? And so you can see, for example, the risk and vulnerability assessment has a lot of different components because it's very dense. And each of these components has its own scoring scheme. So to give you a sense of what our spreadsheet looks like, if you go to the next slide, you are not intended to be able to read this, but basically we have a spreadsheet that looks like this that goes through every single component and has a description of what it means to be scored at a 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 for each of those, for each component. And so what we then did is we took this scale and had multiple people review in really close detail 4 representative resilience strategies. So these were communities from geographically different parts of the coast. They were different sizes in terms of their population. They were also different socioeconomically in terms of the wealth of the community. And they were also different in terms of whether they had just done phases 1 and 2 or gone farther into the RCCP. So we really tried to choose a wide, diverse sample to evaluate. So for each of those 4 communities, we scored them from 1 to 5 on all 22 components. And the result is on the next slide. So this is kind of the big, messy version of what we saw when we scored it. So on the left, you can see the section and the components, and then each of the resilience strategies is its own column. One thing I want to point out is this community 4 on the right-hand side was actually in the very first wave of the RCCP, and the others were in the subsequent one. And so I think one of the reasons you see a lower score here is because the guidance actually improved a lot between the first round and the subsequent rounds. And the other thing I want to note is that there are, like, even within a given community, there are kind of very distinct areas of strengths and weaknesses. And so it tends to not be the case with this one being somewhat consistently strong with only a few exceptions. The others tend to have areas where they're very strong and areas where they're less so. And so it really wasn't the case that it was like everything was great or everything wasn't great. It was a much more mixed set of results for each strategy. Let's see, I tried to pull out on the next slide. Yeah, I tried to pull out some of the key points for this particular audience. So obviously the handbook requirements were met the vast majority of the time, which is great, right? There weren't very many 1s or 2s on that slide before. And so the vast majority of the time, the people are really meeting what is being asked of them. I think what we saw in 2 of the more common weak areas were on social vulnerability and natural infrastructure. And it wasn't that they got totally ignored in the strategies, but the way that they got treated was relatively superficial. And so, for example, on natural infrastructure, it may have just been that like all the parks in a community were treated as natural infrastructure, but there was no attention to other things that may contribute: marshes, wetlands, dunes, other types of assets that make up natural infrastructure. Or social vulnerability may have been addressed for the entire community, but not in any geographically explicit way of looking at where do these things overlap with some of the hazards that we're looking at. And so the ones that did do this well tended to actually try to weave that information in a more detailed way throughout the entire strategy, rather than just having it be a standalone section that never got brought up again. Another location where we saw some strategies distinguish themselves were in the ways that they were specific to the community. And so, for example, using stakeholder input or public input to identify the locations of risks or the locations of assets, rather than just using data products that are widely available but may not be as locally valid as kind of talking to people who know the area really well. Relying on more local data sources, as I said, and explicitly integrating public input into the risk assessment and project portfolio. And so I think the more that the documents really tried to connect all the pieces together, right? Not just being like, here's where people live, here's where some assets are, here's where some risks are, but really trying to connect all of those pieces of this is what we're hearing from people. Here are specific assets that are at risk from these specific hazards, and here's the projects that can address it for these populations and so forth. Those tend to bear strategies as well. Next slide. A couple of things that we heard in interviews that I thought would be helpful to share. And I actually, as Mackenzie said earlier, like I think there's huge opportunity for peer learning, because what we heard from contractors was often so different in terms of the approaches that people were taking. And I think, of course, the communities that you're working with are really different and are going to approach it differently. But it did feel to me, as someone who's not doing this, but hearing from a lot of you, that sharing lessons learned and sharing best practices or ideas for getting around specific obstacles with communities could be really valuable. So I really encourage you to do that. On public and stakeholder engagement in particular, for example, we heard from some contractors that really made special effort to try to engage groups that weren't well represented, even when their local government contacts didn't necessarily have those connections already. And so that was one way where we saw engagement, like some contractors really going above and beyond in engagement. Another was trying to take a bunch of approaches to engaging the public. And so rather than relying on, we're going to have one open house at the government building for this section and one open house at the government building for this next section, trying to use a variety of approaches that could be complementary and access different parts of the public. And then I think the third thing was, again, there was the strategies did a good job of showing that surveys were done or showing that open houses were held, but actually not as many showed the information that was gleaned from all of that public input and then showed how it was used in subsequent stages. So that was another place where we saw more variability. Next slide. Okay, yeah, another thing we heard a lot about, and Mackenzie referenced this as well, is how to really smooth that transition from going from phases 1 and 2 to phase 3. And so the local government staff that we talked to, they really valued that this phases 1 and 2 could lead to something happening on the ground. That was a huge theme of what we heard from them. And the focus on community and the focus on projects. I remember speaking to one local government staff person who said, I just pull out this document and I just want to work down the list. Like, I just want to check off the first project, get to the next one, figure out a way to fund that, check that off, right? And that's ideal. Like, that's what we want to see in terms of it being useful. But there was definitely acknowledgement on both sides that it was not always easy to go from the phases 1 and 2 document to phase 3. And so, for example, some of the local government staff said, like, well, we had no idea how much this was going to cost, right, this particular project. And that made it really hard for us to even think about how to start. And on the other hand, some contractors were like, I don't actually know if this project would be feasible because the data to figure out if it would be feasible in this place didn't exist. So some of the things we heard, and again, I imagine many of you in the room have ideas about, about what you've done to address this that would be good to share. But actually, rather than jumping all the way to the project in the portfolio, people listed data collection or feasibility studies as priority projects, perhaps in addition to the project itself, so that the next thing on the list could be, we're going to figure out if this project could be done in this place. Obviously, whenever possible, providing as much information in the resilience strategy, providing what the local government needs to go to phase 3, right? And so even the text on scoping and on budget and so forth, a lot of our local government respondents talked about the more detail they had there, the easier it was to think about pursuing engineering and design. And then another approach we heard from contractors was in the case where they didn't have the information they needed to do the scoping for a project in a specific community, at least providing examples of similar projects in other places, so that potentially, either the cost information itself could be useful, or they could have a conversation with that other community about what that process was like, so that would be another way to help them move forward. So yeah, we heard a lot of different ideas on this, and I think there was definitely mutual recognition from the contractors and the local governments that this was a place that everyone wanted to improve on. All right, I think that's all I have. I am happy to talk more about the evaluation. I'm happy to hear more input from folks that have been participating or that are interested in participating in the evaluation. So you're welcome to reach out.
Thank you, Dr. Hino, so much first for joining us today. I know you're busy and to go through that. We're just so excited that you've been working on this. And this is already looking like it's really coming together and it's going to help us. So does anyone have questions for Dr. Hino? Let me see, was there one in the chat?
There's a few questions in the chat, Mackenzie.
All right, sorry, I can't see.
Oh, I'll read them.
Thank you.
Gordon is asking, he says, I see that social vulnerable population has an overall low score. How is that ranked?
Sure. So that was not just were socially vulnerable populations identified, but also was there information on where those socially vulnerable populations may be, or that locations of assets that are valuable to them. And then, to what extent does that information about socially vulnerable populations propagate through the rest of the strategy? So I remember, like, just off the top of my head, talking to one contractor where, like, you often, a common thing would be going to the CDC's Social Vulnerability Index for information on that type of thing. But that's available at a census tract scale, and some communities might be even smaller than that. And so I remember one contractor we talked to said they looked for specific assets. So for example, like a senior center or a healthcare center or a place where someone with chronic health needs would go to access care. And they tried to be, or schools, right? Like they tried to really pinpoint the locations within a community, given that a census tract level thing wouldn't provide kind of distinguishing information within a community to help. So that was one of the reasons why socially vulnerable populations did not always get a high score, was because sometimes it was it was there, but it wasn't really without much detail and without much connection to the rest of the strategy.
Thank you. And there's one other question from Lawrence Frank. How can we access those projects in other places? And Gordon says, perfect, thank you.
That's a good question. I don't know that we asked the contractor who told us this what they did, but I actually know separately, it was, let me see if I can find it. Amanda Martin had shared with me a website where they had actually aggregated a bunch of the flood resilience related investments and projects that have happened in North Carolina. And I've referred my students to that for examples. So it's going to be in my email somewhere. Let me see if I can find it, because I actually think that would be a great place to look for example projects.
Miyuki, is that
The Resilience Exchange?
Maybe? Let me look at it. Okay. Find funding database. No. I will look for it and I will put it in the chat once I find it.
Thank you.
It was like flood specific, and it was like a map. Maybe it is here. Oh wait, is this it? Okay, anyway, I will keep looking and I'll put it in the chat, or I'll just say, yes, this is it.
Okay, that's the end of the questions. There's one comment from Jamie. That's the end of the questions.
All right, well, thank you, Miyuki. And we'll go ahead and move on to our next presentation. We're excited to welcome Rebecca Ward and Georgina Sanchez from NC State. Rebecca and Georgina are leading experts in community engagement, in my opinion, from the CCREP program, which focuses on helping communities meaningfully participate in resilience planning and coastal hazard mitigation. And they'll talk to you way more about this than I know, so I'll go ahead and pass it to you guys.
Awesome. Can you hear me okay? Okay,
Yes.
good. Awesome. Just getting my notes up here. Thanks so much for inviting us to come talk. So I'm Rebecca Ward. I'm the director of the Coastal Community Resilience Immersive Training Program. I lead this program with Dr. Georgina Sanchez. Hi, Georgina. And so I'll be presenting today, but then Georgina can jump in with anything I miss, and then, of course, answering questions. So yeah, so this is a 10-week internship program, and the rationale is really, you know, what's behind the RCCP program. I feel like, you know, that we want to try to advance resilience for communities in North Carolina, and but not all communities, right, have the resources or the technical capacity or expertise to begin this process for resilience planning. So the CCREP program, the goals of this is to really provide that technical assistance at the same time that we provide education and workforce development for AmeriCorps interns. If you go to the next slide, our model is really strongly following the RCCP program. So thanks so much. So we, right, so the RCCP program, everyone here I think is really familiar with it, right? We are focusing on just on phase 1 for our CCREP program, that community engagement and risk and vulnerability assessment. We're also working with communities on the coast. We define that really broadly. So we do work within the CAMA counties that are shown there in the green. We also do work outside of CAMA counties. We're kind of not limited in that, but it's been really rewarding to work in both sides and see the differences there. So I wanted to talk just a little bit, you know, today about community engagement. But before getting to that, I wanted to just give everyone a little bit of an overview of what the CCREP program is. So it's an internship program at its core. We hire 6 AmeriCorps service members each summer. We give them the job title of assessment coordinator. And then over the course of a 10-week program, they are working together as a cohort. They get support from 2 program mentors, so myself and Georgina. And we also bring in a lot of content experts from academia, state government, federal government, right, to come in and share their insights, expertise with those service members to inform their work, and also just to expose them to lots of, career opportunities in this resilient space. Some of you on the call today have been a part of that, so thank you so much. In the course of the program, we partner with one community each year. We define community pretty loosely. It could be a town or a city, or it could be a county, unincorporated communities. To date, we've been partnering at the county level. That's just how it worked out. Jones County in our first year and Gates County in our second year. And then over the course of those 10 weeks, our AmeriCorps service members, they go through a really deep, intensive training, which I'll talk a little bit about. They are working with the community that we are partnering with. Specifically, we identify a single or a couple of key community partners, leaders, liaisons that they're engaging with, but we try to get out as much as possible. They're mapping assets, conducting a risk and vulnerability assessment, and we try to be really tailored in our approach. So everything that we're doing is really based on those community interests. And at the end of the program, we deliver a risk and vulnerability assessment report, right? So this technical document, we look at a lot of existing resilience portfolios and vulnerability assessments from the RCCP program as guidance. So again, if any of you here on the call today have been in the program before and done one of those, thank you for providing a great model for our interns to follow. We deliver this report to our partner community as a PDF. We also give them a Word document, right? Because we want to make it as easy as possible if they're going to copy and paste language into, future grant applications, that they can do that. We also give them all the data that we have used and generated as part of the process as a zip drive. We keep a local copy, so if they ever need to reach back out, we've got it. Nobody has reached out, but it's there. And then we also develop a story map. So this is hosted on our servers at NC State. The idea with that is just to have a bit more of a public-facing, almost celebratory story of that community and our work with them. Importantly, the final day is when we deliver all of this, but that is not the first time that our partner community is seeing what we're doing. We're really trying to let them see along the way the progress of our work. And so that's where I want to share a little bit about the T, right? This T. Just to say, our community partners are Jones County and Gates County so far. We've been a pretty short timeline for our program. We started in 2024 with our first iteration after launching the Coastal Resilience and Sustainability Initiative. Here we are in 2025. We have did our second year of the program, and we are also developing courses at NC State. And then in 2026, we will have our third year of the program, as well as hopefully building capacity through developing continuing education and professional development courses at NC State. So I'll talk briefly about that at the very end. Now onto the training content, I think is the next slide. Yes. So one of the reasons to talk today is a little bit about our approaches and strategies for community engagement. And so to get there, just briefly talking about all the skills and knowledge that's required to do this work, right? It's a lot to do a vulnerability assessment. We try to instill this into our interns over the course of 10 weeks. So we focus our training on a lot of different topics. I've highlighted a couple of them here, right? The what, the why of our work. Why is it important to engage with community members? The technical skills they need to carry it out, like GIS analysis. And then also things like how to send an email and set a date for a meeting, basic survey work, communicating in written and oral formats. And we arrange this content so that service members can learn the content and then really quickly turn around and apply it in the work that they're doing this summer. And so one I highlighted here, we really heavily emphasize the importance of engaging with the community. And so there's two reasons that we really strive to emphasize this. So the first is that we know that there's a lot of data out there when it comes to assets or hazards, but we know they don't capture everything, right? So they might be dated, or they might lack some detailed resolution. They might be based on models versus observations. So all of these things are limitations in the data that we have. And so even though we strive to use the most robust and high quality data that exists, we know it's not going to capture everything when it comes to trying to assess, where are community assets and how are they vulnerable to certain hazards. But the people in these communities, right, they're living with this every day. And so that, when there is a flood or a hurricane, right, when there's a thunderstorm, they know where those impacts are going to occur. And they know how they're going to affect them. So, right, understanding not just exposure, but the ways that, the community itself is sensitive to those and how they are able to adapt. And so just a really brief example on the next slide is to talk about the value of ground truthing. So this is, it's a busy map, but you can just kind of glance at it and look around while I describe this. So Jones County was our partner in the first year of the program, and they had some really recent experiences with flooding. Hurricane Florence in 2018, Hurricane Matthew in 2016, and going back a few decades prior to that, Hurricane Floyd in 1999. And so Jack Voigt, one of our interns, he created this map here. He really went out of his way to meet with emergency management, with the mayors of several of the towns in Jones County to really understand how these events, not where they just impacted the county, but how since then the county, the municipalities have responded, the ways that they've been building resilience. And so as in the course of this work, he created a map, not this exact one I'm showing here, but a version of it that showed buildings in Pollexville and where we have data sets that estimated floodwater extents during Florence and Matthew. And he labeled on his map something like buildings flooded during Hurricanes Florence and Matthew. And the mayor, he sent this to the mayor of Pollexville, who came back immediately and said, circled on the map, these buildings, they were not flooded. And these ones here that you're showing were safe, they were flooded, right? So he really had that ground truth information. And so, we learned a valuable lesson there about, saying things like buildings exposed to potential flooding, right, during these events, to really ground truth that data and send it to them early. And then kind of like Miyuki said in the last talk, right, explaining that in the final report, explaining that in the final presentation we give to our community to really explain the process of how we assessed flood risk in this particular area using all the different data sets and how we then ground truthed it. The community really appreciated that we had gone through that extra step to just validate the data with them first before sending that final report to them at the very end. So if you go to the next slide, another example of how our interns have engaged our community partners and to really incorporate that engagement into the product that we're developing at the end. So we use this, vulnerability equation that we see here. Vulnerability is this combination of exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. And we feel like computing exposure is pretty straightforward. Sensitivity is a little bit less straightforward, but we still felt pretty okay assessing that. But when we got to adaptive capacity, right, this ability to adjust to potential impacts from hazards, we really felt like we just, in the course of this 10 weeks, we just couldn't really do that adequately. And so we really needed our community partners to weigh in on this. And so in the second to last week of our 10-week program, we go as a group to our partner community, and our interns present their preliminary findings to community partners. So anybody that we have engaged in the process up until that point, we invite them, and we also invite them to invite others as well. We usually have an RCCP because we try to feed them. So we want to have a good head count for pizza, but really it's something that we try to be nice and open so that anybody can come. And as part of this, if you go to the next slide, we bring a big poster where we've tried to synthesize our preliminary assessment, each of the asset categories. We have broken down, what has been our assessment on this categorical ranking of none, low, medium, or high exposure, sensitivity, and then we really kind of leave adaptive capacity blank. And we ask our community partners, we have our interns, they have conversations at this poster to try to get that input, and then we incorporate that into the final report that we deliver. In Jones County on the right, in 2024, we had a lot of really great engagement with this approach. We had less in Gates County this most recent summer, I think just in part because we just didn't really leave as much time as we wanted at the end. So we're still learning from this this process and how to best structure this, but still really valuable to provide that clear outline of what we have done and what we are finding, and then taking that input into our final report. And so then I just wanted to, on the next slide, I have just a couple of pictures. So just some final takeaways on things that we've learned in doing community engagement. And again, reiterating that these are interns who are just learning how to do a lot of this for the first time, and just really exceed all of my expectations. So it's pretty hard to build rapport and trust in just 10 weeks. It's hard to do that in a year. As the program director, I try to do my best to get that ball rolling early, right before the program starts in May. I try to start engaging really heavily in February and March to really secure a community partner, and then do some initial groundwork in building trust, so that our interns can come in and really hit the ground running. In Jones County, that was some Zoom meetings and a face-to-face with the county manager. In Gates County, it was some emails and Zoom meetings with the planning director, and then presenting to the Board of Commissioners. We, as a group, we go down to our community partner in the second week. So we have everybody coming out. We sort of try to do a marathon of meetings with different department heads, and really trying to get like emergency management, county management, planning, right, like key groups in the county. But then, whoever really is able to meet with us, we go out and we talk. And in every one of those meetings, we say, where should we go to next? Who should we talk to? So on the lower left here in Jones County, there's not very many restaurants in the county, but one that was really like the local watering hole was Aggie's Pizza and Subs. If you're ever driving through Jones County, highly recommend you stop there. So everybody in the county really seems to go there for lunch, right? Because there's about 2 options for restaurants at lunchtime. And so our interns got permission from the restaurant owners to go there. And while people were waiting in line, and this was really just like everybody, kind of a convenience sample, but still trying to get beyond just those county leaders. They had a poster there with some questions about, what are assets that are really important, what are hazards that are really important, and engaged with the community in that way to get their perspectives. They also went to the filling station in Jones County. So this is a local organization, a nonprofit. They also have a food pantry. And so while folks were waiting in line to get food, they went and talked to people as well. So just trying to get out and, find those ways, who can we connect with that would be willing, getting permission to go and talk to them. In Gates County, we heard baseball games were the place to go and engage. And so that's what our communities did. They didn't get any engagement at the baseball game, but they still showed up. And so then when they went to future engagements, right, people recognized them with their AmeriCorps t-shirts on. So even if you don't get anybody coming up to your table with your map, it was still important to show up and be present. And I think that's my last thing, is just, trying to make sure that we're meeting the community where they are. We go to Board of Commissioners meetings, even if we're not presenting, but just sitting there and listening and seeing, what is it that the community cares about, afterwards going up and saying hello to the Board of Commissioners, right, or town councils. It's just really, the more you can be present and show up and show that you are caring and listening, not just when the meeting is about you and what you are here to do, the more that you're really able to capture and understand what it is that the community values. And so I'll just kind of, end here and say that what we really try to do is just treat this as data, right? We bring this back into the final deliverables. So just like we treat, NOAA data or USGS data as important, we try to also consider this another data point that we weave throughout. The last thing I'll say is that we do have a website. Feel free to email me. We have now 12 alumni who are really fantastic future resilience leaders. If anybody has any internship opportunities for undergrads, we would welcome the opportunity to pass along information there. So yeah, I'm happy to take any questions. And Georgina, did I leave anything out?
I don't think so.
All right, thank you guys so much, Rebecca. That was great. We've had so much fun coming to meet both your groups of AmeriCorps students now, going through this, and it's amazing what they can get done in 10 weeks. So yeah, well, if we're ever hiring, let them know. So does anyone have questions? I can't see the chat because I'm sharing my screen. So Rachel, do you mind helping?
There's no questions in the chat yet.
I know you said you didn't get a lot of feedback at the baseball game, but I thought that was such a great idea. I've never even thought about that.
Yeah, our interns were really disappointed that nobody came to their table, even though they went out and tried to, steer people. But we said, that's still good. You still showed up, and you still got to go to a baseball game, right? So.
Oh, I have a question. Oh, well, somebody said, Meg Perry said free hot dogs at the booth next time.
That's a good idea.
I'd come talk to you. And then Julia Lane is asking, was the secret program born between joint needs between DCM and NC State?
Yeah. So, so this is funded by, I didn't really go into the details on how this is funded, but it is like internal funding from NC State and some external awards. In the sense that it was a recognition that here is a really great model that DCM has developed, and we see that there are still, continued, areas, gaps that we can continue to support and collaborate on. And so, in that sense, yes, it's that point of needs. But I will also say that I did not write the proposal that launched the program, so I can't speak to like the exact conversations that had.
But we do hope that you can continue and the RCCP can continue, because I think there's obviously a lot of overlap. Oh, someone raised their hand. Molly, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, I had a question for the adaptive capacity scoring that you did in like the community setting. Did you have to give folks a presentation like primer to that, or how did you kind of like group that in with your engagement that you were already doing that day?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yes, because the community did not know what adaptive capacity meant, right? That's such a jargony term. So we, our interns, we have them give about Georgina, is it like about a 20-minute presentation? I mean, it's a full presentation, like 15 to 20 minutes, that covers their assessment process. And so we sort of like lead the whole thing up, describe what, how we're assessing vulnerability, work through the different aspects, and then like describe what that adaptive capacity is. And so we really try to we give a full presentation on their work and then describe exactly how we need additional input from them. That's how we try to frame it.
Yes, and if I may add to that, it's a bit of a hybrid approach. First half of that hybrid being us as a team and the students led by the interns, doing as fair as doing their best effort to estimate what adaptive capacity for the different assets would be. And then, yes, through that conversation with the community, then diving down to the, I guess, weak aspects, the aspects where even though we had our best effort to try to understand and anticipate, predict what adaptive capacity would be, if there are some specific aspects of that assessment where we are still uncertain, then we would try to guide them and provide the very specific amount of information that we need so that they can help us move forward with like filling in those gaps. What is about adaptive capacity that we haven't yet fully comprehend for these very specific community? But we try to consider that ourselves first so that we have, like, let's say, a starting point, and we're able to determine, okay, this is what we can determine ourselves, but we really need, based on the data, based on our 10 weeks of assessment, but then here's where we really need some help. And we keep on relying on the community to accomplish and finalizing that definition of what we mean by adaptive capacity for specific assets.
Thank you. Yeah, I really like that approach. It can definitely be challenging to score adaptive capacity with limited information in a short period of time. So that's really cool.
Yes, yes, absolutely.
All right, any last minute questions? If not, you're welcome to put them in the chat or follow up with Rebecca and Georgina after. But thank you
Well,
guys so much. Oh, go
okay,
ahead.
you, if we may,
Oh.
could you share a little bit more about plans for the future and for continuous education opportunities where folks from this group could either help support those efforts, but ultimately also find training?
Yeah, so this will take about 30 seconds. So we, as part of our secret funding, so it's a 3-year grant, this initial one, we're seeking additional funding for future years. But in the 3rd year is developing professional development, like continuing education credits through NC State's McKimmon Center. And the idea, it's pretty broadly scoped. So we're trying to figure out what would be most supportive. But the idea we're thinking is if we can provide training for professionals, so perhaps folks who are here today, or maybe people you're working with, right, to be able to do this type of vulnerability assessment or community engagement work that might support this. So we're still developing it, but ideally we're looking at launching it in 2027. I don't know anything yet about like the cost structure or format or things like that, but probably a virtual training type of continuing education broadly around vulnerability assessments. If that's of interest to you, please reach out to me. I will probably be reaching out to Mackenzie and developing this. So yeah.
Yeah, most definitely. And I think as we get started in the fall and into the spring, some ideas might pop up. So we'll definitely keep in touch, the two of us, as you want to plan that. Thank you guys so much. All right, we're doing good on time. I'm going to move us on to our last presenter. We've got Bree Sharon on from the Coastal Federation today, who's going to talk about nature-based solutions and give some examples of how they're working on the ground in some of our own RCCP communities. So Bree, take it away.
Thanks, Mackenzie. Yeah, so I'm Bree Sharon. I'm the Water Quality Program Director for the Coastal Federation. I'm also a water resources engineer, background from NC State in the stormwater group. So I'm mostly stormwater, but I can talk a little bit about shoreline erosion. But yeah, I'm gonna kind of jump. Sorry, I'm not in control. Thanks, Mackenzie. Yeah, so for those of you who don't know us, yeah, the Coastal Federation, we work in all 20 coastal counties. We have offices on the Outer Banks and in Carteret County and in Wrightsville Beach. Our headquarters is here in Carteret County. That's where I'm located. We, our tagline is working together for a healthy coast, and we do that by these 4 main programs, looking at salt marsh habitat, oysters, water quality, and marine debris prevention and pickups. We also have, coastal management advocacy arm and a pretty robust education department as well. Yeah. So before jumping into solutions, we kind of have to talk about like what the typical coastal hazards are that you'll be running through that vulnerability assessment and identifying. But there's some pretty typical ones y'all probably have on the top of your head. First is, just climatically, the coast has higher storm volumes, more intense rainfall, and a lot of that is linked to this next slide with these storms with first names. So this is lovely Hurricane Florence and some of the impacts we saw from that, flooding and lots of things. You're good, yeah. So everyone knows what a hurricane can do. But kind of some other issues we hit is with this higher groundwater table flooding that you can actually encounter. This is a DEM of Pine Knoll Shores, where they've had some historic flooding kind of in between those remnant sand dunes. You can go to the next one. They actually do some groundwater monitoring. You can see that, the groundwater table is just hovering right there a foot beneath the surface, and just a regular old storm. Well, it's not regular. It's a 1-year, 24-hour storm, about a 3-inch storm. They actually have the groundwater elevation surfacing. And so, even on these areas where you have sandy soils and you think you should be able to infiltrate a lot of water, if the groundwater table is at surface level, you're not going to get that infiltration. And where's the water going to go? Next one. In some places on the coast, it's really flat. You probably know that for like looking at the Albemarle Pamlico Peninsula, looking at you. But so we, install these drainage ditches, and then they do a really good job at moving water sometimes, but then they can also become a conduit for storm surge, flooding, and saltwater intrusion as well. So, managing our managing water and flooding on areas that are at sea level and have no fall is another issue. Next. And then tidal influence, in our built environment right there on the coast with our king tide events and old infrastructure that's actually kind of being infiltrated all the time by saltwater at high tide. What happens when it rains on top of a king tide, and now you have this, which is a sunny day flooding event, become an extra rainy day flooding event when you have rainfall on top of that. And then just looking at our infrastructure next, when you have a stormwater outfall hitting salt marsh, and it's pretty much underwater at high tide, what solutions are there? And that's just, hitting our infrastructure needs, pairing it with capital improvement, that sort of thing. And then coastal erosion, you have these kind of typical marsh-side erosion from just boat wakes or storm events, but then you also have these really high riverine bluffs on the next picture. This could be chronic erosion, but it can also be from those large storm events as well. So those are two different types of coastal erosion issues that have very different solutions potentially. So I'm going to jump into solutions a little bit. So, yes, there's probably a gray solution to most of these issues, but for the RCCP and what the Federation, tries to do is look at how we can use nature-based strategies to come up with practices in both the urban and rural landscape to solve these problems. And mostly on the stormwater side, our kind of philosophy is mimicking the natural hydrology pre-development. So slowing down the flow of runoff, giving it the time and space to soak in. We really focus on reducing the volume of runoff rather than, the traditional treatment train approach, not really looking at nutrient reduction, but rather like just getting that volume of water back into the ground or somewhere where it can sit for a while without impacting our built environment. And then also with the nature-based strategies, working with the land and the conditions available, given the space we have. There might be more space in that rural landscape, but then in the urban, fitting things into tight corners. Next. So in 2021, we worked with a lot of stakeholders, including consultants on this nature-based stormwater strategies action plan. And so it kind of has a lot of options written into it. And so I just kind of wanted to put it up here as a resource, but it also kind of has some good communication points for pushing green solutions within it, like, capital cost savings about the 80% for doing green infrastructure, really balancing those flooding and water quality impacts while also looking at the economic development and natural resource management. And it shows that actually, nature-based stormwater strategies are actually, adaptable into the existing landscape and, can make sense in a variety of areas. Next. So part of that plan, it was broken up into 4 separate work groups, focusing on these kind of 4 components here. And I think it really makes sense looking at RCCP as well. So I'm just going to run through some options here on this slide. So you're good. Go back, Mackenzie. Sorry. I know. I feel like it's hard to not be in control. So retrofits are kind of where we're talking about, fitting things in, doing the best we can with the space provided. So we might throw the MDC out the window a little bit when you're talking about stormwater solutions because, we might have more run on that pervious pavement than typical. We might also have that mix of gray and green infrastructure where, they might be going in and wanting to put in a new road, but how can we pair, pervious parking with that sort of thing. This is also where looking at capital improvement plans that are already kind of laid out and budgeted for is really important. And then pairing, if you're going to tear up the road to put in a new sewer, when you go back and lay that road, why can't we do something with the stormwater as well? And then on new development is kind of where those policy and ordinances come into play, getting the planners involved so that they are on board with green infrastructure, because a lot of times the planners are the first ones to see those developments coming into the office. And if they're able to say, hey, it might not be, there's no stick involved, but if they can lay out some carrots of why they should be implementing some green infrastructure on their site plan, it might actually be mutually beneficial to the developer and the town. moving forward. On roadways, I'm just going to say it, work with DOT. If you have a contact with DOT in your community, I think DOT is a great resource. They know where the problem issues are. They probably already have a maintenance scheme laid out. And so pairing projects with DOT is a huge deal. They probably own most of the impervious surface in your community. We worked really closely with the hydraulics department over the year. They actually have, a number of retrofits they're supposed to hit each year. So, getting up with them if you have a great project that hits DOT right of way or one of their streets. And then on the working lands, so looking in the kind of more rural landscape, we're targeting opportunities that are going to benefit private landowners primarily. So whereas in the urban landscape, we might be looking more at like public properties or right of ways, now on working land, you're looking at private landowners. And so you really have to hit those benefits to everybody really hard to get people on board. But this could look like, taking marginal ag lands out of production to create like a flood storage site, or looking at, working with your local land trusts or other nonprofit organizations like TNC, looking at those kind of opportunities for longer term landholders like timber operations who might not be looking to stay in the area. So it's kind of a longer view sometimes, especially with kind of conservation work, but it's another important part of our landscape. And then I also wanted to tag in the working lands, like don't forget about USDA programs, because that's another source of funding for some of these projects on the rural landscape that I think if you're willing to work with an RCS, it's a long process, but they do have some pretty standard practices out there. Okay, I think next I'm going to jump into some project examples, and these are based on watershed plans that the Federation has, but they do kind of pair up with, I think all of them pair up with RCCP communities, so that was convenient. You can jump to Beaufort. So we worked with the town of Beaufort in 2017 on their watershed restoration plan. It's a EPA 9-element plan. And this project was actually identified in 2017. So the town of Beaufort was, and DOT were kind of working together for the bypass of Beaufort. They were going to hand Cedar Street over to the town from DOT. And so as part of that process, we knew in the bypass that Cedar Street was no longer going to be a main thoroughfare for traffic heading down east. It was going to be much more localized traffic. And so, the town really wanted to look at that opportunity to kind of do a road diet and also kind of more like aesthetic project as well. So we worked with them and DOT, and McAdams ended up doing the final plans for some pervious pavement and some infiltration cells. And so here's the pervious pavement installed in parking areas. And then next we have those little bio-infiltration cells, or not infiltration, bioretention cells. But the bioretention cells were actually funded through those DOT retrofits. And then we worked with the town on some other funding for the pervious pavement portion. Okay, go to Final Shores. So I kind of pick on Final Shores with, they've got that groundwater issue going on. I also feel like Final Shores was maybe developed before water flowed downhill sometimes, but they've typically in the past, when they have these kind of flooding events in the center of town, they were actually pumping from street to street to street. And then they did install a system where they could get it to the sound through like a main line from the golf course ponds here. But they were using kind of portable pumps to move all this water. So next. And we worked with them on installing this underground neighborhood kind of collection system that I kind of describe as an underground swale with a submersible pump installed on one street end. And that moves water into the golf course ponds to be, kind of just stored, mostly detention. And then at times the town can actually pre-pump and lower groundwater tables and pump to this infiltration basin on the golf course. So it's a pretty neat public-private partnership benefiting everybody. The golf course was great to work with as a partner. It's kind of complicated, but I can talk more about that project if anyone wants to reach out. But here's the end result of the projects. It's all underground, so it's like the least sexy project to talk about because you can't really go out and see anything. It's just all underground, except for at the golf course where when we did this infiltration basin at the end, we've made it look like a sand trap to kind of blend in with their landscaping. So that was a pretty fun project to work on. And just kind of something that was very much out of the box and probably wouldn't hit the MDC in any way, shape, or form. Next. So in the Newport, we're working on a watershed, or we have a watershed plan for the Newport, and we're working in this area in red on this kind of more landscape scale flood attenuation project. So we've been longer term since 2020 working with the Coastal Land Trust to acquire the properties in yellow, red, and orange from Weyerhaeuser. And we're going to be working, the Land Trust is doing the acquisition work and then handing it over to the Federation to do larger scale. We're going to be kind of basically closing up all the drainage ditches and then creating enough flood storage for holding back about 6 inches on the site. So we do have some of the flood resilience money for this project, and we're kind of doing dual benefit of wetland restoration on these big kind of timber tracts, and then also trying to hold back billions of gallons of water during storm events. And then my last example is around Lake Matamuskeet, and make sure I'm hitting on my, so there's a long story behind Lake Matamuskeet. If you're not familiar with Hyde County, it's been hydrologically altered pretty extensively in the last 100 years. But as it stands now, the lake has a pretty bad water quality issues. And so we worked on a watershed plan with stakeholders around the lake, Hyde County, Fish and Wildlife Service, WRC, and then a lot of private farmers as well. And out of that has come these projects that the intent is moving water away from the lake, creating kind of that emergency outflow for the lake to reduce flooding along the rim, but also filter that water while we're pumping it. So we don't want to just pump what's primarily ag water into the sound. So if you go to next slide, these are just 2 projects that have been identified and we're working towards on Burris Canal, kind of putting in a pump station, working with Fairfield Drainage District they'll be able to use for, keeping water levels low enough for ag during the summer. And then if there were an emergency event, they're able to kind of run that pump to an extent that we would be able to move water from the lake and lower the lake levels, pairing it with a lot of other projects around the lake. Same thing with the Simmons tract. This is a private landowner who's enrolling his land in an NRCS wetland reserve easement. So they're paying for all the wetland, restoration work and diking, and then we're working with them on, the county being able to pump water into that wetland, again, during flood events to filter it before it goes out the other way to the other side of the dikes. The county also has some other Lassie money for another pumping project similar to this on the north side of the lake. So a lot of work happening around Lake Matamuskeet, kind of working with our ag landowners, finding the ways that we can keep them in ag as long as possible, but also acknowledging that we've got to move some water somewhere sometimes. Okay. Okay, and then, so living shorelines, so shoreline management also occurs on this gray to green scale. The gray side is bulkheads, on the green side are living shorelines. And so, for those of you who aren't familiar, living shorelines are shoreline erosion management technique that utilizes some sort of wave break device and then hopefully restores the marsh wetland behind it. So it's a little bit of a greener solution. If you do it right, you can create habitat for this heron catching this nice big fish here. And so this is kind of one of those low energy situations where we can kind of put something low offshore and then really plant the marsh back behind it. Okay, next. Here's a situation where you have a shoreline kind of out front of what is a really big bluff, and with marsh being planted behind it. And then next, this is the kind of shoreline. This is a high tide, of course, but offshore, you can see the tops of the sill offshore. It really depends on what type of infrastructure is being protected and how much land there is to play with between that infrastructure, what kind of living shoreline gets designed. And so, if you're trying to protect a community college from falling into the sound, you're going to put out some larger riprap probably to maintain that shoreline. But if you have the space to play with and lower wave energies, something kind of lower scale, can almost be put in by hand is another option that we're working with. I think that's it. I kind of blew through that probably, but that's it. Any questions?
No, not at all. I always learn something new when you guys present. So thank you, Bree. Does anyone have any questions for Bree? I guess, Bree, I'll start with one, and it might be a tough question, but what would you say is the biggest hurdle to implementing a nature-based solution? Is it getting the council on board? Is it permitting? Is it all the above? Like, what advice would you give a contractor?
Yeah, don't get me started on permitting. Sorry, as I'm talking to the permitting agency. No, I mean, I feel like we've had, really good, not luck, but we've worked so closely with the communities from the ground up when we're pitching these projects that there's a lot of stakeholder engagement happening. And then, some of it we've had the opportunity, like the Newport work, we're working on our own property, so that's always easy too. But finding those kind of champions for the plans and folks who are really bought in and making sure town staff, as we are all talking to each other, I think we've had instances where I'm working with the town engineer, but the town planner is the one doing the planning work. So making sure that everyone knows what different projects are happening and what the different goals are is probably one of the challenges that we've seen, is just having the communities, everyone be super engaged in what the solutions are.
A question in the chat from Ken Wilson. He says, great presentation, Bree. Are you able to do much long-term monitoring of water quality or flood frequency to quantify the effects of some of these projects?
Yeah, so we're actually doing some we're doing a lot of pre-sampling on the Newport right now for those larger scale wetland restoration projects, and we'll be hopefully doing monitoring as those go on. We've done, in the past, worked a lot with, universities like UNCW. Mike Mallon's done some infiltration testing for us on some of our projects in Wrightsville Beach and in Wilmington. So some of his studies are published on that. So yes and no. I think some of our kind of smaller little pervious pavement projects that we're not doing a lot of monitoring on, just but we are, for this kind of landscape scale, trying to make the case. And in Hyde County, we were doing a pretty robust sampling effort as part of the funding we have up there.
This isn't a question, but this is more of a, Jamie Heath says that they have a hard time with permitting living shorelines, and that we need to CAMA needs to look at ways to streamline the permit. Jamie, can you send me specifics that you've had problems with, and I can share that with our policy that does the rule development? Because I think that would be helpful for them to hear as feedback from our program. I see Bree smiling.
Yes, we definitely can.
Thanks, Jamie.
Thanks.
Abby Moore has a question. Do you have any guidance or resources that could help communities and contractors estimate the costs of nature-based projects? I know that's always a big question.
Yeah. Well, we do such a wide variety. A lot of our wetland work is coming from some NRCS contracts that we've worked on in the past. And then, just recently, because I was very appalled by the price of pervious paver install in our last project in Wilmington. So I feel like we were operating at a very different level than what the current is, but so I don't think we're not the ones doing the design on most of these projects. It's we work really closely with with a variety of engineering firms on these projects, and they help us pull together costs.
Well, I'm going to follow up because we have people who've worked on previous phases 1 and 2. Do you have any resources or guidance that have helped you cost out projects? I guess if you want to just raise your virtual hand so we don't have everybody going off at once.
Well, it looks like that's a gap that we need to fill. Um, so we'll try to look internally if there's got to be something out there. I'm not sure, but that could be something where we can try to help. Because I know that's hard, Abby. It's trying to, you're trying to fill out the project portfolio the best you can for the community, but getting a real accurate estimated cost is, I know that's hard. So
Yeah, I mean, the better, we're happy to share pricing that we have, like on the shorelines. I know we have like a range of different shoreline types and materials and the prices. And then, I mean, I'm happy to share pricing that I have just from some of our like retrofit projects and wetland projects, if anybody was needing them, just from the most recent things we have. If you're just looking for an extra line to look at.
yeah, Bree, if you can send those to me, then I could distribute them to them if they need them. And
Okay.
then David, did you have your hand up?
Yeah, just a quick comment. If it's by the foot or the yard, costing would be more valuable than project specific, unless we know how many feet or how many, it is. So that's all I'm saying. Would be that comment. So.
Dawn, do you have your hand up?
I did. I was just looking back through some old email correspondence because I know that we were asked to contribute some costing for the Carrot Island Living Shoreline project. And I think there was a call for nature-based solutions costs from ERDIC, from the Corps. So that may be more national, maybe not North Carolina specific, but let me look for some more relevant information and I can share that directly with you and can be passed on to contractors.
All right, thanks, Dawn. All right, any more questions for Bree and or our other presenters that might still be on, or for us before we give you 10 minutes back of your day?
There's one more question from Julia Lane. What is generally advised for evaluating risk and vulnerability for the community with regards to town boundaries? In the previous round, we included a 5-mile buffer around the town jurisdiction and the ETJ to capture natural infrastructure and assets that are still beneficial to and used by the community.
That's a tough one. I'm going to say the way that you did that, Julia, is how I would say to go about it next time. Kason or Rachel, do you guys want to?
A great start. I think maybe that's something that we can explore more. I mean, I'm a land use planner. We stop at boundaries, but I don't think that's necessarily the most valuable way to go about this work because boundaries are just arbitrary. So I like the idea of going 5-mile buffer around the town jurisdiction.
Yeah, I would say I agree with that. I mean, and then maybe for resources where, if a natural resource is extending potentially further, since that's kind of a transboundary thing, maybe you could look at those on a case by case basis. 5 miles around seems very reasonable to me. But yeah, like Rachel said, maybe we can look into that on our side and see if that's, typical or effective, that sort of thing.
Thanks for that. Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, I was just curious about that. That's how we operated on the last round. And also similarly, like when we were working with the town of Bragg, for example, we had a community outreach event where somebody from a neighboring town came, and they were a couple miles up the road, but they weren't necessarily within our evaluation area. And so we kind of didn't know how to approach that. So that's kind of like along the same lines that I was thinking there. So yeah, any thoughts you have, that would be great.
All right, well, I know there will probably still be questions that come up, and that's totally okay. I also will have questions throughout this process, and we're going to work together to get through them. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us via email or give us a call. And I want to thank all our speakers for coming on today. This was super beneficial for me. I hope it was for you too. Let me go ahead and let me stop recording.